Hello and welcome to our viewers in the United States and in Europe. I'm Steve Sokol and I'm the president of the American Council on Germany, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the second event in our new virtual series, which we are doing in cooperation with 1014. This series is called Hot Topics, Cold Realities, and in each episode we will explore the issues that are dominating the political debate in Germany and the United States. We want to try to unpack our hot topics with German and American guests so that we can look at the cold realities of what is going on in a number of different areas. We started the series with a conversation on migration, and today we're continuing with a conversation on tariffs and trade.
Thank you, Steve. And I'm Katja Donovan, the Executive Director of 1014. We're very delighted to be partnering with the ACG again, and I'm very much looking forward to this timely series. Today, we're addressing the use of tariffs and their impact on trade, particularly between the US and Europe, but also globally. With President Trump's announcement to impose tariffs on China, Mexico, and Canada set to take effect tomorrow, respectively, according to breaking news just coming in a month for Mexico, after a conversation between the two presidents, the situation has sparked intense debate. Has President Trump triggered a global trade war? Or do we witness the end of globalization as we know it? Or has President Trump simply taken necessary steps to address the US trade deficit, increase employment and wages, raise living standards, and grow the economy? Joining us from Germany is former Vice President of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, Rolf Langhammer. Professor Dr. Langhammer is an expert on trade policies and has served as a consultant to a range of international institutions as well as to the German government. Also with us is Benn Steil. Dr. Steil is a senior fellow and director of international economics at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. He is the lead writer of the Council's Geographics Economics blog. He also created interactives and he has published extensively. So we've had Ben before. So thank you very much for joining us again. And thank you, Rolf, for joining us for the first time. We're delighted to have you here.
My pleasure.
And before we get started, let me remind our viewers that 1014 and the ACG are nonpartisan organizations. So the views expressed in this conversation are those of our two experts. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function, as Steve said in the beginning, and let us know which speaker the question is addressed to. We will do the best to fold your questions into our conversation. Steve?
So obviously this is a really big topic, and I couldn't be happier to have two such distinguished guests with us today for this conversation. Our timing could not have been better. Since we have a lot to cover, and I'm sure that there will be a number of viewer questions, we thought we'd share a little bit of how we'd like to structure the conversation today. We'd like to start by setting the stage with a brief explanation of what tariffs are, how they work, and perhaps a little bit of historical background on how they've been used. But then, of course, we want to focus on the current situation and discuss whether we're seeing the start of a new era of global economic nationalism and what this means for consumers. Then we can look a little bit more in detail at the implications of free trade, the future of free trade agreements, globalization, and the system of global worldwide supply chains. And if we have time, we can conclude by looking at the future of multilateral agreements and entities such as the WTO. So this is a pretty ambitious agenda for the next hour, but let's start by trying to establish a baseline in terms of understanding the use of tariffs so that we have a framework for our conversation. Rolf, let's start with you. Can you share with us sort of how tariffs work, what they're used for, and a little bit of history about how they've been applied in the past?
Okay. Well, tariffs serve two functions. First, as a revenue for a budget, and second, of course, for protectionist purposes. That means the poorer a country is, the less it can rely on taxing internal domestic transactions, and therefore it concentrates on taxing international transactions, basically imports, sometimes exports. So the poorer a country is, say a developing country in Africa, Latin America, the more weight tariffs have as a revenue. So the US and Europe, of course, is not, of course, a poor region. They do not rely on this revenue function. They rely on the second function, which is protection. And here, again, we have a source of, let's say, conceptualism on the protectionist function of tariffs. This is called the infant industry protection argument. Say you have a young industry which is exposed to international competition, but it wants, of course, to provide goods like education for the young economy. Then this infant industry protection argument says, yes, you should protect these young industries against more competitive industries. Otherwise, we would not produce these, what we call external goods for the economy. And this is maybe, of course, an explanation why, for instance, in the multilateral trading system, the GATT, the post-war trading system, this infant industry argument is heavily enshrined in some articles of the GATT. That means, okay, you are a young industry and you need that protection. The problem is that protection never ends, of course, so you can't really put an end to that. And there are strong political forces to say we need more protection, more time to become competitive. And from traditional, or let's say transitional tariffs, it becomes a definite tariff. So the question is, of course, are tariffs effective? Yes, if they're very high, they are prohibitive. Sure, of course, they stop international trade. They protect, of course, the domestic production. Sometimes they are also redundant. That means there's water in the tariff and saying, okay, you can change the tariff, but nothing happens. And that is, of course, a very interesting debate. So it's not quite clear whether really protection is served by tariffs. In some industries, like services, we do not have tariffs, and services are the most vibrant economic sector in the world, especially in the US, to some extent also in Europe. So the second aspect of protection is not fully clear, but of course it is true, yes, there are costs of protection for consumers. We pay higher prices. Tariffs usually tax more the poorer people than the richer people, of course, so a single mom is more charged by tariffs than, say, her boss. This is what we know. But nevertheless, of course, some people think that protection through tariffs is still effective.
So, Rolf, just as a quick follow-on, and you started to touch on this, at the end of the day, who ultimately bears the cost of the tariffs?
Two parts. Well, first, the consumer, and the question is it a final consumer, so a private household, or is it, let's say, an industry which manufactures certain products? Say, if we have tariffs, steel tariffs in the US, or aluminium, of course, those who need steel to be manufactured, the car industry, the airline industry, and so bear the costs. So the question is, what is the balance? Are the steel workers, of course, they get their jobs, and they get also maybe higher wages because of these tariff protection, against those, of course, who have to bear the costs as they are transforming these products into, let's say, advanced products like the car industry. So the balance, I think, is very clear. The manufacturers bear the costs, whereas those who produce, let's say, the product which is protective have less weight in the economy than the manufacturing industry which process these goods.
I'd like to bring Ben into the conversation. Ben, we've heard a little bit from Rolf about the effectiveness of tariffs, or the ways in which they can be effective. Obviously, the effectiveness of a tariff depends a lot on the circumstances under which it is implemented. When you think about tariffs, do you look at them primarily as an economic tool or a political tool? And how do you sort of assess the effectiveness of tariffs that have been levied?
Well, you have to take a holistic perspective, Rolf was talking about steel tariffs, for example. If you say that your objective is, for example, to protect steel jobs in the United States, tariffs can be an effective way to protect steel jobs. Unfortunately, if that's the limit of the range of your consideration, you're missing its impact on other parts of the economy. Unfortunately, employment in steel using industries in the United States is approximately 40 times that of steel manufacturing industry. So if you go back to the steel tariffs of the first George W. Bush administration, the early 2000s, we actually saw massive net job losses owing to steel tariffs. So it's important to take a holistic view. I would also add one other objective of tariffs that was particularly significant in the Biden administration, and that's national security. That is, many of the Biden tariffs were instituted specifically to keep certain goods, mainly Chinese, out of the US market as they were seen to be a threat to national security. This includes, in particular, products of the Chinese firm Huawei, network goods that could be used in principle as a vehicle for the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, to extract private information from the United States, or even to control major public facilities in the United States. So that's another element of tariffs. With regard to trade deficits, President Trump and his advisors have often justified tariffs on the basis that they're necessary to reduce the U.S. Trade deficit with the world. It's important to understand that unless they're imposed universally, what they tend to do is shift deficits around. And we saw that in the first Trump administration, when the US trade deficit overall actually rose. It didn't fall. So we saw manufacturers moving out of China into places like Vietnam. Often that wasn't real manufacturing, that was just rerouting goods in order to get around the tariffs. Second, tariffs tend to push up the US dollar because the demand for foreign currency in the United States goes down as we import less. And as the dollar goes up, that has a tendency of increasing the deficit. So tariffs, broadly speaking, are a very poor tool to use if your primary concern is reducing deficits.
So let me follow up with you, Ben, on this. You've talked a little bit about the use of tariffs under the George W. Bush administration, during the Biden administration, and during Donald Trump's first term. You also talked about the national security perspective, and certainly this time around, President Trump is using fentanyl and illegal migration as sort of the main reasons for putting tariffs in place vis-a-vis Mexico and Canada. Can you share with us what is maybe different about the use of tariffs under the current Trump administration from the way in which previous presidents have used tariffs?
That's true. This is relatively unique in economic history, using tariffs as a vehicle to extract political concessions from other countries, not just adversaries, but in this case, allies. If you go back to the most famous episode of tariffs and counter tariffs of the 20th century, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, for example, this sort of geopolitics was not involved. It really was the sort of pure protectionism that Rolf was speaking about. Now, how effective can tariffs be? as a geopolitical negotiating tool? Well, it depends who's using them. When it's the United States, yes, it can be effective. We've seen already that the Trump administration used it effectively vis-a-vis Colombia, which had initially resisted taking back migrants that the United States wanted to return to Colombia and U.S. military transport planes. But after President Trump threatened to apply 50% tariffs, Colombia backed down. But we've got to ask whether that sort of success is a short-term success or a long-term success. Because among the effects that using tariffs as a geopolitical tool against allies like Colombia is going to have is to break down these alliances. We haven't yet got into US-EU relations, but geopolitically, that alliance has been exceptionally important going back to the earliest days of the Cold War after World War II. Donald Trump, as you know, is a transactional president who doesn't really believe in the effectiveness from a U.S.-centric perspective of alliances. So he tends to, in my view, underweight the importance of maintaining alliances in terms of U.S. geopolitical priorities on a wider basis.
Yeah, thank you so much. So let me just maybe continue with you, Ben, on that. Because I think we can all agree that we see a resurgence of economic nationalism or protectionism. And you just already elaborated a little bit on the effectiveness for economic objectives, but also for political objectives, and just assess that this is a new way of for imposing it, and not just with adversaries but also with allies. But I'm just a little curious about the popular support in the United States for these tariffs. So it seems like, President Trump, he was very vocal in his election campaign that he would impose tariffs, and the electorate went for it. So yeah. It looks like there is support for tariffs, and I'm just wondering what your assessment is on that. Is the public in the U.S. sort of ready to eat up the basically the negative effects of it for another gain that everybody seems to be seeing? Or what do you think is happening?
Yeah, the polling data aren't really that favorable to the Trump administration on tariffs. The public has expressed reservations about tariffs. I think they do understand that tariffs do tend to increase prices. And as you know, the price levels in certain areas of the U.S. economy, in particular groceries, for example, things that people buy every day, that was a major issue in the last campaign. I would say this broadly of Donald Trump's supporters in the United States, that they tend to take him very seriously, but not necessarily literally. And so when Donald Trump makes pledges to impose a certain level of tariffs on certain countries and to escalate it, I think most of the American public, certainly his supporters, tend to tune out the details because they assume that those details will be fluid and will change over time. And they tend to respect Donald Trump as a negotiator. So I would not interpret President Trump's early strike on the tariff front as an indication that the American public is all behind this. As you yourself said in starting out this session, we've got breaking news already that President Trump has apparently put tariffs against Mexico on a hold for a month. And a month is really a lifetime in this sort of environment. And it would not be surprising to me if we see more breaking news as we're speaking. So we should never lose sight of the fact that Donald Trump is a negotiator. He likes to trade. He likes to do deals. And he likes to be able to claim that he's won. And he's given himself multiple metrics by which to judge victory. Does it protect, for example, U.S. steel jobs? Does it, for example, help keep fentanyl out of the United States? Does it help prevent illegal migration? To the extent that he can claim victory in any of those areas, he's likely to consider changing course many times throughout this month.
Yeah. Rolf, let me just pivot to you and to Europe and Germany. So I just have a personal sense that maybe what resonates also with voters is creating or maintaining well-paid jobs, also dignified jobs, for example, in manufacturing, right? So I do think this is probably true also in Europe. And you just, when you started, you mentioned infant industry protection. This is what tariffs have been used for effectively. But what about using protectionism to basically take back a certain amount of like traditional manufacturing jobs that got lost in globalization? Is that something that also Europe, you see Europe or Germany particularly striving for?
We have a lot of experience with that since the formation of the European Economic Community in 1957. So we had always the conflict between a manufacturer, which was Germany, against a country like France, which is relying much more on agricultural products. From the very beginning, the tariff levels between the two are very different. And it was a really hard job between 57 and 68 to come to a free trade area. That means removing all the trade barriers within the community, and of course coming to a final external tariff, coming to the customs union. So the Kennedy round at that time, so that means the GATT round that was concluded in 1967, helped a bit, lowered the tariffs, but nevertheless, of course, this conflict between the two always stayed out. We had a lot of experience with, let's say, an invalid or misleading policy to protect old jobs, say in the textile and clothing industries in the 70s, when we, of course, for some time kept wages in the clothing industry at a high level because of protecting against the newly industrializing economy in East Asia, Singapore, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and so on. But it turned out that it was a failure. It was a complete failure. And then it became clear how large the costs for the entire economy were to rely on old jobs, which couldn't be defended. Then Germany shifted, of course, and was always in favor of more liberalization against a reluctance of those, especially France, but also others, Italy, against too much liberalization. So the idea of Fortress Europe, say, hey, liberalize within Europe and keep a high wall, a strong wall against foreign trade, was always propagated by France against, of course, Germany saying no. Our field is the world. We are export-oriented. We rely on our export manufacturing industry. And of course, this is not only in the European Union, because of course, we were very, very successful, most successful in China so far, and also in the US. US is by far the largest export market for Germany. Therefore, of course, the idea of protective tariffs were not very popular in Germany since the disaster of the 70s, when we had to pay a high price for defending, let's say, the clothing industry. And it is also shown that we could, let's say, transfer these jobs into new jobs, even the clothing industry, let's say, from consumer, household, and services and protection against new products like industrial fibers, industrial fabrics, not in T-shirts and so on. That, of course, was gone. But it took a long fight, and the trade unions, of course, were very much in favor of protection. But when the costs became clear, Germany in total, let's say, were more, let's say, I wouldn't say a free trader. We have no free trader in Europe, nor in the US, but of course more in favor of, let's say, MFN treatment within the international trading system, rather than protecting, let's say, sectors like agriculture or some industries in France or Italy.
Can I jump in there, Katja?
Please.
I just wanted to emphasize that the early efforts at European economic integration that Rolf speaks about in the late 40s and early 50s was intimately tied up in the transatlantic security relationship. So as Rolf said, Germany was, before the war, a major manufacturing power. France was primarily agricultural. After the war, the United States wanted to rebuild that sort of structure in Europe, an economy based on an efficient division of labor. But the French and the British objected to this US plan because they said it would undermine their security. The French, for example, said, well, look, you're withdrawing all your troops from Europe. How can we depend on a German coal and steel industry if at any point when they leave, Germany could cut us off? How would we defend ourselves? How would we defend ourselves against the Soviets that you claim you're so concerned about? And so whereas the United States was actually trying to disengage from Europe after the war, the Marshall Plan was a way to get Europe back on its feet and allow Europe to take responsibility for its own security. But it didn't work out that way at all. In fact, a year and a day after the Marshall Aid legislation was implemented in April of 1948, we got the NATO Founding Act legislation in April 1949. So for the Europeans, that transatlantic security dimension was absolutely essential to European economic integration. That is, you wouldn't have had that confidence in France and Britain to participate in a reintegration of the European economy had the United States not provided security guarantees. And of course, with Donald Trump back in the White House, one has to ask whether those security guarantees will continue to be credible.
So that just one last comment, and then back over to Steve. So of course that's one of the constant criticisms of U.S. administrations, not just under President Trump, but also previous administrations, that Europe is not really living up to its promise of taking care of its own security. And rightly, we benefited probably in terms of economic, in economic terms. But I'm also interested, Rolf, you also mentioned Fortress Europe. And I think it's also a criticism of US administration. Not only is there a trade deficit between the US and Europe, but also Europe is imposing tariffs on imported goods. And now they introduce a carbon tax. So how much of that is true? So is that really is that something to criticize? What's the dimension of this? So I know you use Fortress Europe in a historical perspective. But does that still hold true for today?
The problem is what I call, let's say, sustainability issues, which are unilaterally imposed upon other countries. And you know that the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Measure, which are going to be introduced by 2026, not earlier, is, in my view, let's say, a casus belli for the US. Because it would mean that we are measuring the CO2 footprint in American products exported to Europe under European prices for CO2. And that is something which, of course, President Trump would never like. He would hate it. And he would say, this is, of course, let's say, an announcement of war. And therefore, I'm rather critical course, there are alternatives saying, okay, we should, let's say, try to come to a common sustainability standard for the environment, maybe also for labor right protection, which is the other thing, which comes in the due diligence legislative directive of the European Union, which is also something unilateral. And the problem of Europe, not as a fortress, is that is saying, wait, we are exporting our ideas on sustainability to other countries, regardless of whether these countries agree or not. Huh? This is a unilateral measure, and this is very critical because it, of course, it will trigger responses from poorer countries, also from the US, of course, and saying, no, we have other standards. And the ideal point of conflict is between Europe and China on human rights and so on and so on. So, and that is very, very critical. And my hope would be that, of course, the European Union would go to these countries, discuss about sustainability issues, which are reasonable in the sense that these countries can handle them technologically, financially, and so on, to our countries. But also, of course, with respect to the US, the idea is a climate club. It means coming to a common CO2 price, which I think under Trump will be not possible so far because he turns the wheel into the other direction, to the fossil energies again. So that is Fortress Europe is something where we export our sustainability standards unilaterally to third countries. And this, I think, this is what we criticize. And this is really not the right way, in my view, to, let's say, engage with other countries, maybe in some sort of alliances, free trade agreements with countries. And in all these free trade agreements and negotiations, say with India, with Australia, and so on, apart from agriculture, which is always one barrier, is, of course, the sustainability standards of the EU, which are very high and which are unilaterally imposed upon third countries.
Of course, the
EU,
can
go
I
ahead.
just jump
Yeah,
in
yeah,
very briefly?
please.
The EU and the Biden administration had very similar views on sustainability. Nonetheless, there was significant conflict between the two about how to translate those commitments into international economic policy. For example, as we know, the EU was extremely concerned about massive US subsidies for EV production in the United States. So even when you have two regimes that see eye to eye on sustainability, you can have considerable conflict on the trade front. And as Rolf has said, now we have a regime in Washington that puts no emphasis whatsoever on the sustainability front. And therefore you can expect that dimension of trade conflict to be ratcheted up even further.
So that's actually a perfect segue to a couple of viewer questions that have been submitted. One viewer is curious what some of the existing protective tariffs are that the EU has imposed. And we were talking a little bit about EVs just a moment ago. And Rolf, since you brought up CBAM a moment ago, another viewer is curious whether CBAM's introduction could not be seen as a reason for the Trump administration to impose retaliatory tariffs on Europe. And I think both of these questions tie in together of how these new tariffs on the European side or on the US side could ultimately affect the EU's climate goals. I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on the whole climate piece of this as it relates to tariffs.
Okay, there are two questions. First is about, let's say, high tariffs on the European side. We have two. One issue is agriculture, where we have a tariff level which is twice as high as the US level on agricultural imports. Second, we have this outlier of a 10% car tariff on car imports, which dates back to the Euro round in the 90s. We have not changed it, but at that time, of course, we thought that Japan was the major threat. And we had, of course, to compromise with member countries within the European Union, France and Italy and Spain and Portugal had quotas against Japanese cars. Germany had no quota. That was, let's say, not compatible with the European single market. We had to find a compromise, and the compromise was this outlier of a 10% tariff. Usually on manufacturers we have 4-3%. On cars we have 10. The US officially has 2.5, but of course, if it goes on pickup trucks and so on, it's much higher. But nevertheless, of course, this 10% is something, a relic from the past, and we should lower that. And our idea from my institute is to say, hey, why not lowering this 10% car by, say, cutting it by 50% to 5% for EV cars on an MFN base? That means for everybody, not only for the US. So that is a signal that we want to support the international trading system. So that is one point. Agriculture is a valid point of critique in the US. And second, of course, the car tariff. And then CBAM. CBAM, of course, requires that the so-called free allocation rights of big polluters in the European Union, the cement industry, the steel industry, and so on, these free allocation must be abandoned before we come to that. Now, we can imagine under the current situation, weak growth, small growth in Europe, that these lobby groups, of course, fight against the removal of these free allocation rights, pollution rights. They are given free certificates to pollute. And of course, this is incompatible with, let's say, the introduction of CBAM. So first of all, remove the free allocation rights. Second, maybe CBAM. But CBAM is highly complicated, of course. And we see lots of resistance, not only from the US, but from other countries saying, no, we can't do that. And we are not accepting that. And they are threatening to close down any talks on free trade agreements. That relates to Australia with coal. It relates, of course, to other countries, the poorer countries. So it's simply, maybe it's a balloon which will not fly, but so far, of course, 2026 is still on the agenda of the European Union. I have my doubts whether they will really be accomplished, or maybe delayed, but anyway, it is, of course, it's putting fuel into a fire with all negotiations of third countries.
On the energy front, I do see one potential source of optimism in terms of US-EU relations, and that is on the natural gas front. As you know, the United States, even going back to the Biden administration, has been extremely concerned, at times angry, that the EU continues to import natural gas from Russia, which is a security threat, not just an economic blow to the United States, which has become the dominant liquid natural gas exporter in the world. So to the extent that the EU can pledge to import more LNG from the United States, given that the world is not going to be weaned off natural gas any time in the next few years, I do see the basis for an agreement that might ratchet down the temperature somewhat on the tariff front.
Can I ask one quick follow-up question before Katja jumps in? And that relates directly to this. You know, as we talked about at the outset, it looks as if the US and Mexico put a stay on the implementation of tariffs. In many senses, it seems as if Donald Trump might be building up in German, I'd say Drohkulisse, but sort of a threat, threat perception to try to have a stronger negotiating standpoint. And we haven't heard very much about Europe in the first 2 weeks of the Trump administration. I know that there's a lot of concern in Europe about the potential of tariffs coming their way. But picking up on your sort of sense of optimism, Ben, could it be that there could be some negotiating that we see unfolding behind the scenes, not implementing tariffs in exchange for buying more LNG from the US, much as we've seen on the US-Mexican border, the provision of troops on the border leading to a postponement of the introduction of tariffs?
There are going to be deals going on from multiple fronts. With regard to Latin America, the United States has economic aims. As you know, the Trump administration wants to repatriate more manufacturing business to the United States. And on the security front, where Donald Trump has elevated migration, illegal migration, to the status of #1 issue. Now, he's already had success on that front, as I said earlier on, with Colombia agreeing to take back migrants from the United States. Now, Mexico seems to be coming on board for a tighter regime as well. And given that immigration, in particular illegal migration across the southern border, was such a major issue in the presidential election, this could give President Trump a major win. With regard to Europe, you know, I had mentioned LNG on the economic front, but there could also be a deal to be done on the security front. As you know, the first Trump administration said Europe had to meet its 2% pledges. That is, it would dedicate 2% of its GDP to security. Now, the second Trump administration has ratcheted this up to 5%. That would suggest that there's a deal to be done roughly somewhere in the middle, in the range of, say, 3.5%. And given that Europe accepts that there is a significant security threat coming from Russia, there is a common interest with the United States. So I expect security and economics to be completely intermeshed in these tariff discussions.
May I add to Ben's remarks? So far, I have been reluctant to take the word security. The reason is very simple, because it's very difficult to come to a common stance in Europe on security. In Germany, we have defined security to protect critical infrastructure. So about 10 sectors which have to do with all sorts of logistics, infrastructure, and so on. That is our security point. Other countries, of course, have different, let's say, views on security. And of course, the European Commission has not the competence, like in trade, to negotiate on security issues for the entire European Union, which is also split in the Eurozone and in the non-Eurozone, about security. So one point, of course, apart from obvious, let's say, deals like buying more weapons from the US and raising, of course, the defense budget share and the GDP and so on, is, of course, a common stance against China. So far, the European Union has no stance towards security issues on China. For instance, we don't have in our investment laws no outward screening. That means screening of our investment in China on security issues, simply because we have not a common position in the European Union on security. Say there is between Orban in Hungary and, let's say, the German, let's say, coalition, so far as it works, but also the next one will be, of course, again, very, very complicated. And this is exactly what Donald Trump wants. He wants to split the European Union because he doesn't understand, of course, why an institution like the European Union has something to say on national security. That is not a national security, it's a regional security, but we are not yet, of course, a confederation or something like that. So that brings us to this. You boil it down only to economics, and economics is, of course, enshrined in Article 21 of the GATT, where you have an article where you say on security issues, some trade measures are possible, but of course, it's very difficult to define what then security is. But the US view on security goes far, far wider. And in Europe, we do not have so far a common position on what defines and what constitutes European security. This is
Can
why
I jump in there?
Yeah,
Steve, on the whole question of security, and Rolf raised the GATT, WTO, very significantly during President Trump's first administration. The United States was notifying regularly the WTO of trade barriers that it was raising on the grounds of quote unquote national security. And as Rolf emphasized, that has always been, going back to the creation of the GATT, been a legitimate justification for raising trade barriers. But the United States did two things. Not only did it accelerate the use of the security notification, but President Trump put a total freeze on the U.S. Authorizing the nomination or renomination of judges to the appellate body for the dispute settlement mechanism. Now, why did they do that? The United States did not want the WTO sitting in judgment of U.S. national security designation. So since 2019, there has no longer been a quorum within the appellate body to hear appeals of dispute resolution cases. This means that for all intents and purposes, there is no WTO. The WTO cannot adjudicate any trade complaints whatsoever. Furthermore, the U.S. has taught the entire world to use this national security invocation. Since 2019, we've seen a massive rise, absolutely unprecedented historically, in the use of this national security notification, particularly from the developing world. You go back to 2019, back to the beginning of GATT, and you saw virtually no national security notifications from poorer countries. Fast forward to today, and they represent 70% of national security notifications. What sort of things are being justified under the guise of national security concerns? Import of cocoa beans, import of alcoholic beverages, import of door frames. These are things that are clearly not related to national security, but everyone has learned from the United States that this is the new get out of jail free card. If you want to implement protectionist policy, all you have to do is tell Geneva that it's being done for national security purposes, and no one can retaliate against.
So one thing I'm curious about, we have not really spoken in greater detail about the reaction of the three affected countries so far, but I think what we hear from China is that they want to file a lawsuit at the WTO against these tariffs. So I'm just curious, since I don't think the national security clause was invoked this time. What do you make of this, and how serious are the Chinese, and how bad are actually the 10% tariffs on China? Is that not just basically a forceful de-evaluation of their currency, which might be called for or might not be called for? So what's both of your takes on the Chinese reaction and maybe the future of the WTO in general?
Should I start? Yeah. Compared to the 60%, which Donald Trump, of course, announced earlier on tariffs against China, 10% is, of course, a very modest, let's say, instrument or measure. And the Chinese have reacted very moderately. They take it to the WTO. Of course, everybody knows, and Ben said it, of course, this is window dressing. Nothing will happen. But of course, it does constitute to say we are not, of course, taking that for granted. We bring it to the WTO. Maybe the first court will decide. There's no second one, the appellate body. So nothing will happen. Okay. And others, maybe Canada and Mexico, maybe also the European Union will also go to the WTO and open or ask for opening a dispute settlement mechanism. That's it. At the moment, of course, the debate goes on China with respect to, let's say, beggar my neighbor policies, because the Chinese currency is depreciating. And there's a lot of manipulation in exchange rate policies in China, of course. And the Chinese currency has become a very important currency, not only in Russia, but also in other BRICS countries, like in India, like in Argentina, and so on, with swap agreements and so on. So that, of course, brings China into a sort of problem with respect to the exchange rate against the dollar. De-dollarization is what the Chinese would like to do, but on the other hand, they do not want to come into trouble with the US. So far, this is a very moderate position. It will not hurt very much the Chinese, clear, because with most important products we would like to export, the US market is closed already. So the only market at the moment for Chinese products, under the situation in the domestic market, which is driven by, let's say, burdened by deflationary tendencies. We have lots of excess capacities. We have an excessive subsidization of production. We have no support of consumption so far. This is the policy of the party. They rely on foreign customers, and the foreign customers are in Europe, especially for those products which Chinese companies export. EV cars cannot be used in Africa or in Latin America, so they only can be, of course, driven in the European Union, which gives, of course, the European Union a good bargaining chip to deal with China. So I think the 10% at the moment on Chinese exports to the US doesn't mean very much. And the other hand,
sorry,
okay.
Rolf.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
I would just highlight one significant difference between this round of tariffs from the first round of tariffs against China and the first Trump administration. There was a so-called de minimis exception during the first Trump administration, which survived into the Biden administration. So what does that mean? When you and I go on Amazon and buy stuff made in China, almost all of that is exempt from tariffs under the de minimis exemption that was for items under $800. That's pretty significant. Virtually everything I buy from China online is under $800. My understanding is that de minimis exemption will now go away. So this could really be felt by U.S. consumers. With regard to China taking this case to the WTO, of course, I completely agree with Rolf that in terms of economics, this is not going to have any effect. But politically, it could have a significant effect. What China is trying to demonstrate to the world is that China supports multilateralism. China supports globalization, and the United States has become the enemy of both. So this is primarily a political step that China has taken. And it puts the United States in a somewhat awkward position because, as Rolf said, the EU and other traditional US allies are going to agree with China on this, that we need a multilateral trading system and want to support the institution at the center of this system, the WTO.
You know, this is such a rich conversation, and I'm looking at the clock and seeing that we only have a few more minutes left. And I'd like to maybe bring it back to sort of the impact of the tariffs that we've seen so far. I'm curious when the two of you, and maybe beginning with you, Ben, you know, when you think voters in the United States might see the impact of these tariffs. There's been discussion about, you know, grocery prices going up as soon as the next couple of weeks when it comes to avocados and tomatoes. but also these tariffs having a big impact on the automotive sector, but also on appliances. And so I'd be curious to know when you think this might be felt.
Yesterday. It's immediate. What do I mean by that? Just give you one anecdotal example. Over the weekend, a good friend of mine, Doug Irwin, professor at Dartmouth College, an expert on international trade history, posted online a notice he got from his propane supplier saying that the price of his propane was going to go up in exact proportion with the tariffs being implemented by President Trump. So the effect was absolutely immediate. So a lot of Americans are going to see right away a rise in the prices of things like propane that they use every day. And the Trump administration is going to have to find political means to address those concerns.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, Rolf, to you, as an economist, what sort of an impact do you think this will have on the U.S. economy, and where do you think there could be a cost to the U.S. economy? I found it interesting. Trump has been talking about these tariffs for a while. We did not see a huge rush of businesses to sort of onshore as quickly as possible, but it seemed as if they had been doing this pretty consistently to make sure that shelves are full and that they have the products that they need. But what do you think at the end of the day the cost to the U.S. economy could be of these tariffs?
Well, everybody gets poorer. So that is, I think, the message. But it is a negative sum game. That means everybody gets poorer, but the guy who loses the less, of course, says, I'm the winner. And according to our models, I think the single result which always comes out is the US, of course, losing less than others, because they are not so much, let's say, involved in international trade, at least not in international trade with goods, which carry tariffs. Of course, another totally different story with trade and services. But with respect to trade wars against China, with respect maybe to a trade conflict with the European Union, we are losing more than the US. And President Trump knows that. And he argues, I'm the winner. That's the point. So it's a negative sum game. But of course, we see also that there's more optimism in Europe to say not everybody is decided on the price. So if you have a non-standardized product, so very sophisticated machine tool or something like that, then maybe you can swallow something like a 10% tariff and put the cost on the consumer and saying, okay, you need my product and I charge you. This is the idea. So the less standard, the more standardized the product are, the commodity, as Ben said, with his propane and so on, then of course it happens. Yes, then the price effect is immediate. Mm-hmm. And we have, of course, traditionally much lower price volatility in Europe compared to the US, especially in agriculture, but also in energy products. So we have much more smoother market reactions to price increases in the European Union compared to the US. So the consumer in Europe does not really feel the burden so far. We'll see that. And the most important thing is, of course, as I said earlier on, the most vibrant parts of the economy is the service sector, the tech industries. And of course, they are important. And as the Americans have 60% of their foreign direct investment, of the total foreign direct investment in Europe, that matters. And this is why I say, okay, we should try to, let's say, convince the American subsidiaries in Europe to put a pressure on Trump to say, hey, we are losing because you treat Europeans badly and you cannot force them to buy a Chevy or something like that. So in this respect, maybe we are a bit more optimistic, saying, okay, we can survive a price war so far with 10%, that's moderate. Beyond that, we have to think twice.
And maybe one quick follow-on from a viewer, what the expected pricing policy is of manufacturers who are not directly impacted by tariffs, do you expect that they'll raise their prices as well?
Well, it depends on the market situation, of course. We expect, of course, we have a positive income effect and we have a price effect. The price effect comes from the expected appreciation of a dollar. So the dollar goes up, number one, that helps. And number two, we have, of course, real income increases in the US. The US economy is flourishing. We expect cuts in income taxes and the corporate taxes and so on. So he will fuel the economy. And that, of course, raises an income effect, which is positive for European and for also for basically for German exporters.
This is an important question you ask. It depends very much on what the Fed does or doesn't do. If the Fed is concerned about price rises in tariffed goods spreading throughout the economy, then they are much less likely to lower interest rates and may actually consider raising interest rates. So this new tariff war could have a significant effect on monetary policy, not just in the United States, but globally.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. So we're actually already a little bit over the hour, but I was still, it's so interesting. We could go on for hours and hours, but to first of all, thank both of you for joining this talk today. And I would like to finish with one question that to each of you. So so we talked about the tariffs and its impact also to the consumer, potential trade wars. I do think, though, we observe certain companies repivoting and thinking about relocating their production sites to the United States. That might have been a trend that already started under the Biden administration with Biden's industrial policies. So I'm just curious what your assessment is with regard to globalization, how we have known it. So is that sort of, a trend that will end globalization as we know it, sort of localize supply chains and really like change our global economy? Or what do we have to expect maybe after 4 years of the Trump administration? And with that, I think then, or whatever else you want to mention at the end of this discussion.
We've seen.
Well, it's not. Okay.
Go ahead, Rolf.
Well, it's not the end of globalization. What I see is a globalization of factor markets. That means in capital and especially in labor. But this is what many people say, this is not globalization. The globalization of labor markets, migration. That is, in my view, the issue of the future. Then we see, of course, a decline of manufacturing because of aging economies, of course. People get richer, they demand more services than goods. And of course, also because of the demographics, older people need more services than goods. And that means, of course, that the big times of manufacturing, to some extent, might be getting over and be replaced and substituted for by trade and services. That is number one. Number two is that we see also that means a shift from, let's say, trade to investment. China is wanting to have more people or more investment within the country. We call that the dual circulation strategy. That means getting, of course, more control on foreign technology by inviting or enforcing investment in the countries. That means jumping over tariff hurdles. And that means, of course, less trade. The European Union has this idea of, let me call, friendshoring, nearshoring, relying more on partner countries, and of course, also bringing more investment, maybe also Chinese investment in the EV cars to Europe. And well, Biden did the same, of course. Yes, and Trump will say, okay, you can come to us, produce in the US, that's okay. So that goes all at the cost of more trade, at least more trade in goods. But of course, with respect to trade and services, especially trade to digital services, I think this is the future of globalization, apart from globalizing labor markets.
I think the deglobalization trend is just further advanced in the United States than it is in Europe. In Europe, Rolf emphasized friendshoring. Certainly, the Biden administration embraced this idea But on both sides of the Atlantic, we are seeing a crackdown on migration. It's had very disturbing political impacts on both sides of the Atlantic, and it is finally being addressed in terms of much stricter policy, particularly in the United States. The U.S., as I say, has, however, pushed deglobalization policy now much further than Europe. Donald Trump basically wants to repatriate every possible manufacturing industry to the United States, which is literally impossible. I mean, we have an economy that's running at roughly full employment. We have only a 4.1% unemployment rate in the United States. U.S. economy is running at full capacity. It means anything that we want to now produce here in the United States rather than abroad, we're going to have to sacrifice some other form of production, whether that's in manufacturing or services. This is the main reason why I'm particularly disturbed about the direction in which we're going. There are no indications that a strategy like this makes sense in the economic environment in which the United States finds itself right now.
Okay, I think we need to say, well, this seems to be seen. And hopefully, for sure, the topic will stay on top of our agenda with the ACG and also 1014 as a space for ideas, and we will monitor current debates. So we will certainly pick this up in another few months to see where we're at. But I think, Steve, I can speak on your behalf too, to really thank both of you for joining us today, sharing your vast expertise. So interesting also to reach out into history to really understand better what we're talking about today. And with that, yeah, thank you so much. Thank you to our viewers who've joined us today. And please stay connected, and we'll certainly pick this up again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.